Good morning. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your presence. I know PLs aren't always the way we want to spend our time, but I worked really hard on this, and I'm excited to actually share it with you. So this is the first in the session of 4 PLs that I'll be giving for my culminating project in my specialist degree. So after this, I'll be done. No more school for me ever again. I will not be Dr. Garriott. I kind of went forward. But anyway, go back. Sorry, I was rehearsing. All right, so this session is going to be called Sourcing, the What and the Why. So I'm going to give 4 total sessions. So the first 2 sessions are really social studies based. They're going to be more helpful for a social studies classroom. Session 3 and 4 is going to be really for any department. It's going to be easy to apply to any subject. So session 1 and 2, sourcing the what and why, and then session 2, sourcing the how and the when. I know, exceptionally creative titles to come up with. And then session 3 and 4 is going to be on online civic reasoning, which is essentially sourcing in the modern world and learning how to decide or detect credibility in sources outside of just, here's a historical document we're comparing in class. This is like, how do we use news? How do we use social media? How do we use research, academia, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, so these are 4 sessions. You'll see I have them scheduled for basically every 2 weeks. So for our social studies department, these will take place of our meetings those Tuesdays, and we'll just meet the other Tuesdays. So not a big deal, trying to take as little of your time as possible, but also make it rewarding. So I specifically chose sourcing as my topic for my project because I felt like that was one of my weaknesses. I teach AP classes, and one of the points on the DBQ rubric, the document-based question essay rubric, is on sourcing. And students have to source 3 documents to get 1 point. And my students were consistently not getting that point. They would make efforts and they were trying, but I feel like I wasn't really doing my part to scaffold what they needed. So to make my project both interesting and useful to me, I chose this topic. I also think it's exceptionally important for our students as we live basically in an era of fake news and social media, and kids want to tell me facts on TikTok all the time, and I'm like, not true. So learning how to detect credibility to make sure that sources aren't super biased or they're not telling you true things, or in session 3 and 4, especially learning what websites and what magazines, what we can take. Now, I do recognize that I teach AP and not everybody teaches AP, so not everybody has that DBQ rubric. However, it is a useful skill, and we'll go over what standards it is for each grade. So anyway, yeah, I'm excited to talk about sourcing. I honestly think this project has made me a stronger teacher, and I hope that my resources will help you as well. Okay, so what is sourcing? All right, it is a historical thinking skill. So again, it is one of the historical thinking skills from the College Board, and it is important. So it leads to deeper analysis of the document. So basically, a lot of times when students read things, especially in school, they just take it at face value. They just say, okay, this is true. It's the same thing when they just Google something and the first answer comes up and they're like, okay, this is true. There's no analysis of where that information is coming from and what might be the motivations behind it. So it just takes you to a deeper level of analysis of more of just like, what is this guy saying, but why is this guy saying that? It's also obviously more rigorous for instruction and for activity. And we're going to do an activity on the next slide where it shows that it can also be fun and it can be engaging for students, even though it sounds like it might be boring. So the goal of sourcing a document is for students to be able to determine how the person writing, sharing, talking is impacting the information of the document. And again, I think this can be applicable to ELA, like when you're reading stories and trying to determine, characters and what they're doing. But my focus is obviously going to be on specific primary source documents or even secondary source documents and figuring out where the information is coming from and why that impacts it. My favorite sentence to say, or question to ask them is, why did they say that then? So why are they saying what they're saying when they're saying it? So talking about the historical context, talking about what all goes into affecting how a person is feeling or affecting how they're reading. Okay, we'll go straight into our next thing. So I gave you a little box just in case you want to write sourcing notes, but I don't care. That's fine. It's your prerogative. But if you would make some notes in the image observation, just would be helpful for you because I'm going to ask some questions after I give you the initial image. And I chose an image specifically because I know sometimes in most classes our literacy level is not exactly where we would like it. So I chose an image to show that we don't always have to just use writing or difficult to decipher documents. We can do the same critical thinking, the same rigorous instruction with our visual literacy, which plays into our goal of literacy in all areas. Look at it, relating it right back. Okay, so here is our image. You're going to get the same information students would get on a DBQ assignment with the image. So just where it's from, what it is, and the date. And the only other thing is maybe if this was on a DBQ, it would tell you that the New York Magazine is a liberal-leaning publication. Okay? So if you take just a second to look at it, you want to make your notes. I'm going to ask some questions afterwards. But yeah, I'll give you just a few moments to look over that. Okay, we feel like that was enough time. All right, so my first question is when you look at this image, what is your gut reaction to this image?
Fake news.
Fake news, okay.
Way too close.
Way too close, okay.
He is a loser.
All right. So I actually got this activity from Steve Heimler, who's kind of like a pseudo-famous AP World History teacher. And that's what he said whenever he gives this image, like, his conservative students are like, come on, say something bad about Trump. And his liberal students are like, come on, say something bad. Or say something, they're just, like, combative. Mm-hmm. And he's just like, nope, this is even keel. But it is a very, like, evocative image. All right. So what do you note about the time and the date? So contextualization, so this was printed on the 31st of 2016. Do you know, like, what is important about that date?
Everyone predicted, this is right before the election, 2016. People predicted that he would lose. That's why I say fake news. He's not a loser. He actually won.
Right? So it is before the election, so even while some people might have the attitude that he is a loser, he is not officially a presidential candidate loser yet. Okay, so that 2016 is important. And then the editors. What do you think is the point of this, of choosing this for the cover of the magazine?
It's a liberal magazine.
Yeah, so this is definitely much more of a hit piece than an informative article, right? This is going to be much more like an opinion-based or trying to sway right before the election, right? Just a week out. What's up, Nick? Clickbait? I think that's exactly what that is. Okay. Who are the editors hoping will purchase this magazine? Who do you think is going to buy it?
Liberals are people that don't like Donald Trump.
Yeah, people who don't like Donald Trump.
Or you would have conservatives buy it because they see that and it makes them angry. It makes them want to see what they're saying.
Right.
Because
it's that clickbait that they're like, oh no, what you're saying about my guy. Cool. Okay. So, what do you notice specifically about the image? What is very obvious or different than you see from most magazine covers?
Yeah.
It's not flattering, right? You can see every pore, every wrinkle. Oh yeah, it is not. Nothing here is retouched. If Davis is all the way in the cavities. Okay. Yeah, none of this is flattering. Typically, when you see a magazine, it's going to be airbrushed. It's going to be done over. You're trying to portray people in a nice light. And this one is far from that. If anything, I feel like they just, turned up the contrast and enhanced his imperfections. So all this comes down to, can the participants, or whoever is purchasing this, trust New York Magazine to give a factual, helpful, news-based news-based article about Donald Trump this close to the election? No, right? And the whole thing is everything. Oh no, sorry. The whole thing here is we just completely source this article. So the tool I use for sourcing is a happy chart. So it goes historical context, intended audience, purpose, point of view, and then why is this significant for understanding. Every question I just asked you about this image went in order with the happy chart. So we successfully sourced an image, whereas I'm going to be honest, when I first started, I would get frustrated when I would give my students DBQs and there would be an image on there. I'm like, okay, they look at the map. Okay, they look at the painting. And I didn't really think that much into the visual literacy, the image analysis until we actually started having RPLs on literacy with our instructional coaches talking about how important visual literacy is, especially somewhere where the reading level is low, because it's still rigorous thinking. We still answered all the questions. It just took out maybe some of those students maybe have insecurities, or especially when we have to show historical documents, if there's any these or thous in it, like, you lost a lot of times. And sometimes it is just easier to approach a new concept without content-specific information. So actually in our next session, we will actually go through and analyze for point of view and compare and corroborate sources. And I use this thing I got from an AP Summer Institute, and it's about a football game. And you get 8 sources telling you all different points of view as what happened at this football game. You have to figure out what happened. Now, I would say also this year, I used the DBQ about a breakup between 2 students, and my kids went wild. They loved it so much. They were like, no, I need to know more background about this kid. This boy was being shady, and what about this? And then they were also like, no one uses Snapchat anymore. So they were a little harsh about the technology in the DBQ. But it was really fun. Sometimes it is that hook to get them interested. So having an image, I mean, not every image is going to be as, like, provoking of, like, a scowling Donald Trump with a loser banner, but there are images that you can use, especially, there are some crazy paintings from, like, the Middle Ages and all kinds of stuff, and having the kids analyze that is critical thinking. Obviously, we are going to have to do some documents as well, because they do need to read sometimes. But the happy chart is specifically what I use, and I try to impress upon them, you don't have to do every letter in the happy chart to do a successful sourcing. You really only need one letter in Y every time. At least on the AP exam, to get that point, you have to source 3 separate documents to get 1 point, and that can be kind of difficult. So I created sentence stems, which I'll also post, or I didn't create. I borrowed sentence stems, and then I created some of my own, in the teacher hodgepodgey way of making it work. To show students how to start off to address the historical context and then make sure they address the why. Because it is not helpful for the students to be like, oh, the intended audience of that magazine was liberals. Okay, well, why does that matter? Why is that important? They have to come back around, this is significant because, and then that's also going to help lead us and scaffold us up to my secondary ones where we're talking about how to deal with news sources, how to deal with research sources. Because I did a lot of research. I read a lot of articles, and I wrote a 15-page literature review, which I don't know if you've done that in a while, but it was rough. But there were several media specialists who did the research on how, like, students choose websites, and basically it came down to, like, if they looked nice, instead of, like, understanding what was there behind it. So it's the same thing when we give students documents, they just trust them. So I start off my year when I first do my first, like, little mini DBQ. We talk about were the Persians tolerant, and one of the documents is specifically Herodotus, who is known as a famous historian, but he's also known as the father of lies. So we go through these documents, and I have these documents that, like, support the Persians were tolerant. They were, understanding for the most part, and as empires went at the time, pretty chill. But one document is Herodotus talking basically crap about all these different emperors, and the students always want to believe Herodotus instead of necessarily the other documents that corroborate. So it's just an interesting thing of how students, what they decide to trust and how. But learning how to analyze them helps them understand what they can trust or what they should trust. I always introduce them to, my students had never heard the, take that with a grain of salt before. We had to, explain what that meant. And, every document you read is written by a human. So you have to take everything with a grain of salt because everyone has different experiences and reasons behind what they're doing. So on the back of your handout, I put the charts just so you'd have them. But I also have them on the shared drive so you can access all of the materials. So the next one I got from my research when I was doing my literature review is the iRead. Now, Mr. Hightower, I think this might be more helpful for your students because it is more scaffolding. The happy chart kind of allows them a lot more leeway with which one they want to do and what they're going to do. But this one specifically has the questions to go along with it as the scaffolding. The I is the context of each document. So again, where are these events and authors located? What else is going on? Right. So again, the historical context, basically how our little puzzle piece fits into the big picture. The read is the connect the little C, so the little context, the big context for each document. So how does what was happening in the place time affect what's being written? Examine the author's reliability. Now, this one is they're kind of at the whim of what the little blurb before the document gives them. Now, we did one on the Mongols, and one of the documents was from Marco Polo, and all my kids were like, Marco Polo was a liar. He just wanted to sell books. Which, on one hand, thank you for not trusting the source implicitly, but maybe let's not call him a liar, right? But being able to give them that background sometimes is more helpful, but more times than not, they're going to have to rely on what the historical sourcing blurb says. So again, why did he or she write this? What type of document it is, and then assess the qualities of facts and examples. So is this similar to another document, basically coming through with some corroboration? And then the last one is develop your own interpretation. So what do you understand about this document? What do you know that fits with it? So this one is just more scaffolded. I don't think, obviously, if you were doing essay writing, that this would be great because I think it will take too much time. But to do an actual activity on sourcing, when you're focusing on this skill, I think this would be better scaffolded. So again, I do have this on the drive. Okay, and the last one is definitely more ELA. But I found when I did teach regular that they were already familiar with this. So it was kind of an easy segue. Again, it still covers it, but it is a little bit more, literary, I feel. But it still gets the job done. They're still addressing who is speaking, what the context of what's going on, who is it for, what's the whole point behind it, what is the general subject, and the tone, is the author angry? Because there's sometimes when we read documents and it's during, the American Revolution or the French Revolution, and the tone is very passionate, and that is an appropriate, observation for the students to make. All right, so those were our 3 analysis tools, so that was kind of it for the handout, but I do have more digital sources. So this is just to show you the AP rubric. So this is kind of what inspired my whole presentation, is how to get the point for sourcing. So it just gives a few examples, but it's just specifically showing why this became a thing for me and why I specifically address it, and I try and address it pretty heavy. Okay. The next 2 are grades 9 and 10 are reading standards for literacy for history and social studies. And I put a little heart next to each one that basically shows that for 9th and 10th, and we'll look at 11th and 12th in a second, is it does cover 3 of our literacy standards for social studies, and they are considered historical thinking skills and important to incorporate in our teaching. I think a lot of times this gets left off at the end, but it's fine. It's there. So this is part of our GSE. So cite specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources, and compare the point of view of 2 or more authors and how they treat similar topics, and then compare and contrast treatments of the same topic in primary and secondary sources. So not only are we learning how to analyze primary sources, but we're also going through and discussing, the point of view and kind of what comes up behind it. Okay, and then here's 11 and 12, pretty similar. Evaluate various explanations for actions or events and determine which explanation best accords with textual evidence. Evaluate authors' differing points of view on the same historical event. So a little historiography. Integrate and evaluate multiple sources of information presented in diverse formats. Evaluate an author's premise, claims, and evidence by corroborating. So all of these things add up to be basically sourcing and learning how to analyze our sources. So this is the time I was going to ask for some teacher input. Is anybody able to actively use sourcing in your class? I know it is difficult and it is a skill, but do you have a skill or anything that you would like to share, or do you feel like maybe this is going out again? That this was a helpful thing. So yeah, are you finding it easy to include, or does it feel clunky to include?
No, I think it's really good to include. I know in African American studies, I often give them an image. I only tell them like where the image came from and maybe like the year.
Mm-hmm.
They have to do a lot of historical analysis, looking at it, seeing what they can pull out, and things like that. But they have a hard time of using everything that they see in the image.
Mm-hmm.
Even looking at the little writing that's at the bottom that oftentimes gives you the answer.
It brings it home. If only they would read.
That part is the best part. But breaking it down into like steps,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like constantly using those steps, it would make sourcing or actually understanding what they're looking at a lot better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. So I said what type of activities. So I specifically am using DBQ essays, like it was addressed, but also just general document analysis. So sometimes no essay, just going through, getting the information, and then of course honing our historical thinking skills, and then a comparison of sourcing. Is there another time? So Davis said you're using documents as well, just in class for learning and stuff like that. I also do for AP Human Geography. We ended up reading a lot of current event articles, and it's always like, okay, well, this came from this, so how do you think that this impacts how they're saying? So because I'm able to loop with my 9th and 10th graders, I kind of get lucky that I can kind of start planting seeds more this year than I have in the past, when I've been much more conscious of how important I think this skill is. And then struggling with sourcing, like David said, sometimes it's just they won't read it, and that is a struggle. That's one of the reasons why I led off with the image with one word, to show that literacy, the visual literacy, can still be applied to all the sourcing stuff here. So again, sometimes our lower level students are struggling with rigor with the document, so maybe using smaller excerpts, or giving more background for each each document, or again, incorporating more images can sometimes be helpful, especially when we're dealing with this low reading level here. All right. Anybody have any input that you would like to add, Mr. Hightower?
I mean, I've used sourcing already in my classes. I think it's mandatory, it's essential that in terms of world history courses, that's the very basis of history, is the primary sources that it's built upon. We talk about prehistory, we talk about the artifacts and so forth. So for prehistory, we're out of prehistory now. I used a picture of the rock paintings from Kimberley, Australia, and I thought we had a pretty good discussion on that, because images of prehistoric people with headdresses and all kind of jewelry on. And so I began to ask questions. What do you think is going on here? So it looks like they're dancing and worshiping. And why do you think they have the headdresses? Does that signify anything socially? Maybe a certain status? So you're asking questions. But I think I will link that to a grade. But that was for
those leading questions. Basically, all the questions I asked when we looked at the image earlier were the happy chart, and we went through it. And that's why I liked the Heimler video so much when he used it, because at the end he's like, "Guess what? You just sourced," and it's like you're almost like prank showing your kids of like a gotcha moment. It's like you thought you were just answering questions, but what you were doing was a deeper level of analysis, and being able to show them that they can do it sometimes without really letting them, I don't know if I'm just trying to secretly teach them and just jam stuff in their brain, but yeah, that's why you're just asking almost leading questions, and it leads them to the next step. But I think that's a good point of doing it out loud sometimes is very helpful, because if you give them the image and you give them a chart, they might not be as likely to do it as much as they can share out. And I do find too, like I was really interested in yours because a lot of times, even if they have no idea what's going on, they can draw some conclusions, and they don't think they can until you're like, okay, well, what about their clothing? Okay, well, what do you see about this? So trying to again kind of hook them in and like trick them into learning sometimes. So my next slide. I didn't know if anyone had any specific strategies that you wanted to share. I think Mr. Hightower kind of did. Davis, you've kind of shared as well. But I have some that I would specifically like to share. So my most helpful resources, and I was going to pull these up in just a moment, is the Stanford History Education Group, so also known as SHEG. So it's kind of the basis of most of my sessions is how important and how integral this research group's projects have been for me, because they have not only the historical document analysis, but they also have the online civic reasoning. They kind of support this whole, they have a whole website full of lessons for free. You join with your teacher email, but all of the lessons are scaffolded. So not only do they come with a teacher lesson plan with some like debriefing and advice for how to lead the course or how to lead the lessons, but also each of the documents are no more than 2 paragraphs. They always have a glossary for difficult words. And then all of the questions will be labeled close reading, sourcing, or I think there's like some deeper analysis. But it requires the students not only to just close read, almost using craft, one of our big things here, but also it forces them to do the sourcing. And one of the things I found interesting, so on one of them, the one we do on the middle passage, which I think we'll talk about next time, I think in the next session, it literally has them comparing and corroborating textbooks as well. So explaining to the students how much the primary sources need to be evaluated for reliability. You read 2 textbooks from 2 different countries or experts, and you're like, oh, why do these have different versions of the same story? So showing students not only do we source primary documents, but also we're doing a little bit of baby historiography and talking about who's writing the history, why they're writing history, even in modern times, not even going back to someone named like Herodotus, like father of history, father of lies. And then the next one is active classroom. So social studies teachers, we have access to this whole platform, which is super helpful. Reading the documents or the Historian's Apprentice series are the ones that have the specific sourcing questions. So they're basically set up like the DBQ project, but they're digital, and all the questions list kind of the skill that they're doing, which I find helpful because it kind of showing the student, okay, what am I doing here? I'm not just answering this question out of nowhere. And then of course I put the folder on Google or on Office 365. It's called Sourcing. It's just on our shared social studies drive. So I'm going to pull up real quick the SHEG just to give an example and the active classroom. And then our Title I money came through, and we have all these fancy DBQ project binders right here. So before we only had the mini Q for world history and U.S. history. Now we have the full DBQ for world history and U.S. history, but we also got the mini Q for economics and for civics. So hopefully we'll be able to be integrating that into our projects. I know, Mr. Hightower, you were trying to do essay writing with your kids, and Davis, I think some of these economics would be super helpful, just, even if it is almost like a sub-activity where they do the questions on their own and then you come back the next day and discuss it and analyze it. But I think the full DBQs can definitely take more than 1 day, and mini Q is right around 1 day since we have the 90-minute blocks. But here, let me pull this up really quick. So here is the SHEG. So if you have not created an account, all you have to do is create an account basically with your teacher email. It's super easy. Then they have up here in the banner, I'm using reading like historian lessons just because I'm teaching specifically history classes. And you can select your subject, what you're looking for. So I'm just going to use, I gotta use this one. So it comes with, and a lot of them also come bilingual, so there's Spanish options. So if you do have any ELL students, this one doesn't specifically, but a lot of them do. So I'll have the teacher materials, the student materials. So you can see all the stuff is going to be pretty short, but then it'll have, this one's not a good example because it's charty. But this one, so specifically sourcing, so comparing the two sources, you have to tell which one do you think is more helpful, more credible. And then on Shag, they also have the Beyond the Bubble. So if you're looking for something short, like you're just looking for, usually it's an image with some questions. So it'll give the image analysis, and you can use the happy chart, or you can go further with that. I pulled just a historian's apprentice one from Active Classroom just to show that. It specifically has here, like it'll have the question, will have the thing where it says the point of view. So you know which question, and sorry, I have it up with the answers just because it's the teacher's guide. But yeah, so each one of the documents will have different questions, and then you have the option at the end if you want them to actually write the essay, and they have to do mostly primary sources, but there are some secondary. But yeah, I just felt like it was important to note, like, they lead which types of questions are being asked here. Does anyone have any questions about those resources or about anything, or are we? Oh no, this didn't go off. Okay.
Ms. Garriott.
Yes, Dr. Long.
You're scrolling down your Facebook page or Instagram. These articles are popping up all over the place about, different topics, political, music, culture. What's the quickest way or strategy to teach students how to assess the sources?
Okay, so thank you for your question, Dr. Long. So my second two sessions are going to be about specifically online civic reasoning. So my goal was to scaffold with the first two, being based on social studies. How do you just analyze a document? How do we learn how to compare sources? And then when we get to online civic reasoning, it is essentially teaching students, number one, how to use a Boolean search and actually get the information they want and or need, and then how to determine what they're seeing, if it's true or not. So using specific websites like Snopes or PolitiFact or whatever, learning how to check sources and how to corroborate. So that's honestly one of the things we'll also talk about next session is corroborating specific sources. Okay, I have a source that says this and a source that says this. Which one is accurate? Okay, which one can I find more information to back that up? If I'm seeing one lone document about, how Trump actually won the election and Biden didn't, that's probably not true. Or if it's on somebody's blog, it's probably not true. Especially on websites, learning how to tell, I don't know, I guess what you call it, the suffix, like .com, .gov, .edu, right? Learning how to tell just based on a URL, do I think that this is going to be helpful? Because actually one of the things I saw in my research was that there's a lot of these like scammy news sites that are posting and they're like abcc.com or just like lightly misspelled. So when people just glance at them, they think that they're a true news source or a reputable source, and it's like, no, I don't think so. Or like, I think it was like CNN or something. It was just like silly things, those differences. But there's a whole database. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I saved it in my research of like all these lists of just like scammy news sites that are just churning out, and they generally start out as people's blogs. So a lot of these like Looney Tunes are just writing a bunch of stuff, and then they're like, I know what I'm talking about. I'm going to try and make it reputable. But that's like with students being like, okay, do you think abcc.com is true? And they're like, oh, no, probably not. But yeah, learning how to. I've had a lot of students come to me and they're like, I learned this historical fact on TikTok. And I'm like, where is their degree? Because that is nonsense. Thank you. No. But yeah, I feel like we were talking about earlier, our students implicitly trust the information they're given so often that when I give them a source that I'm like, this is not trustworthy, and they're like, oh, no, it's good. And I'm like, just because I gave it to you to read doesn't mean it's 100% true, doesn't mean it's 100% accurate or credible at all times. But yeah, so we talked about also the DBQ rubric and how important it is to make sure that they are not necessarily having to do each level of analysis, but choosing one level of analysis, so historical context and significance, or point of view and significance. Like, I feel like sometimes my students would get overwhelmed when I would give them the happy chart and be like, okay, analyze these documents, and they're like, this is a lot for just 1 point on my essay, and having to break it down was important. And then, of course, having them be able to analyze actual documents, and then having them analyze images as well, especially in AP Human, we started talking about how maps lie and how you can't always trust a map, especially one that is showing a data set. And I show them 3 maps, and it's the number of Hispanic voters in Florida. And the way they've done it is on one map, it makes it look like there's a ton of Hispanic voters. One map, moderate, and one, like, none, because they changed the percentage and the colors they use on the map. So it talks about how maps can be biased, too. So even when you think you're looking at just data, your data can also be manipulated. And that's part of when you analyze, when you use the happy chart, if you do have a map like that, or if we're looking at historical maps and you're like, all right, we're looking at this map and it was drawn by a cartographer who lives somewhere, how could that impact the way that their holdings look like in the New World, or how the distance looks further or closer based on the year? So things like that, just how, even when you think it's just data, it's not necessarily data. Everything can, even if you don't intend to, almost have an agenda, just because we're human beings and we have opinions and feelings.
I think it's very important to discuss bias,
Mm-hmm.
right? In terms of the documents, you mentioned about maps, cartographers, map makers who in the past have created the world map, and they often had continents like Europe much bigger and larger than Africa, and in actuality it's the reverse. I mean, Africa is much, much bigger. So the bias is implicit in a lot of these documents and these images, and they have to be discussed.
Yeah, the only thing I am just careful with the word bias, because if you let them use it, it's in every sourcing sentence possible. So they'll be like, this is biased because, and it's like, okay. So I try to steer them away, but yeah, obviously there is bias in us discussing it, but I do not let them use the word bias in their essays. I let them, like, okay, explain to me why. They're like, oh, he's biased because he's Spanish. Okay, so this guy is he's a Spanish man, and due to his influence of his culture, maybe he would see things differently. We go over, like, again, some of those sentence stems I was talking about that are sort of leading, that started, because with sourcing, especially with AP, I always say it has to be 2 sentences, because since your first sentence stem is basically addressing what is essentially the bias, or what you're discussing, and then the second sentence is the analysis of why does this matter, why is this important. So we wrote a DBQ on silver and inflation. So all the silver was found in South America, and it led to inflation all over the world, and it became a big problem. Well, they had, one of those documents was a priest was writing about the mine Potosi in South America, and he was talking about how rough it was, but then he was talking about the financial aspects of it, and then one of the students was like, well, this priest is not an economist. He is a priest, so he might not understand exactly what he's speaking about when it comes to the money aspect. And that was an excellent view of sourcing, because you're right. He's a priest. He didn't go to school to be a banker or to be an to learn all these things. So being able to pick out, like, okay, this may be a weakness in this document, or, oh, this might be a strength, it's still analysis while it is, just being like, it's maybe sometimes a little lower level, because we want to rely specifically, or not, I want to rely on the happy chart. Obviously, the eye reading, the soapstone are options as well, but that's just where I am, personally. Anybody else have any questions? Feeling solid? Feeling good about it. All right, so my very last one is just feedback. So it's just a Google form that kind of addresses, do you think that this was helpful? Do you think it was not? Is this applicable for what you do? So the QR code is here. If for some reason it is not, hopefully it's working. I use a free QR code generator, and I'm always very wary of them actually working.
It works fine.
Yay! So it's just a Google form. If you could fill out for me and just give me some feedback, I would greatly appreciate it. So just as a recap, this was kind of the intro session for my 4 sessions. So I called it the what and the why, and then the next session will be in 2 weeks, and that will be the how and the when. I think what I called it. I don't know. I did not get very creative with the names, but we will do that point of view activity I was talking about, and again, kind of hit on what sourcing is and how to incorporate it more easily into our classes and into our lesson plans, and then go forward from there into online civic reasoning, which Dr. Long brought up, which I'm actually very excited about, and might be able to offer to more than just our group here, because I think it will be applicable to others, and especially for our seniors as they get ready to go on to college. Right. Well, hi, this is Beck.
Quick question. Are we ready?
Huh?
Are we ready for tomorrow?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. All right.
I'm not really sure.